there are things we can do sometimes together with New York City Public Schools to try to continue to work through those challenges. Like we tried this accommodation, this wasn't successful, but this part of it worked. We're gonna try this different approach, that we'd love to be supportive to the CBO to figure that out.
Yeah, I mean, I could imagine most CBOs wouldn't want to reach out to say that they couldn't help a kid because it seems like it's a failure on their part, right? So that is, and this is something that I've spoken about a lot before. It does become hard for a provider to come to their funder, whether we like to believe it or not, to their funder and say, I can't accommodate this kid, that is too hard, because you're their funder. So I think there definitely needs to be a firewall around what does that look like and what does that process look like, because it seems like I'm not doing my job, and so I don't want to tell my funder I can't do my job because it looks crazy. But this is happening, and we can't pretend like it's not happening. And so we need to really, this is another place where that there's a clear gap that we need to be tracking it. And we can't help folks if they're not able to really have these conversations. But I understand why they wouldn't, because you're the funder, and that's kind of a hard conversation. And so yes, as much as you want to be supportive, that becomes really hard in those moments, right? And so I can see why a provider wouldn't say that, but I do think that we need to get to a place where we're tracking this so we can better accommodate and support. And does that, well, you said that you guys haven't heard of this, so you wouldn't be in contact with families who might reach out, who were asked to leave a program or who weren't able to be accommodated. And what does those conversations look like?
I am aware of a handful of situations where we're trying to provide additional support to get students. So I'm definitely aware of situations we're trying to support. Wanda actually has been supporting a program, and DYCD has been supporting the family. Do you want to share a little bit about the efforts there?
Yeah, in that, hold on. In that particular example, I'm going to tap into some of what Susan shared earlier. There were multiple points of contact. One, the parent did reach out to our DYCD ADA coordinator. The provider reached out to me to program. And then on the ground, the provider was navigating. It was one of those situations where they do have a good working relationship with the school principal. And so the principal was able to kind of figure out, like, okay, let me see, yes, and share some content. But the provider is still serving that young person. They haven't turned that young person away. In fact, they have been successfully having positive conversations with the family to talk about, okay, what are the points during the day where there may be triggers. And so they've been able to kind of talk through and navigate and learn a little bit more without the IEP. And it's more contextual because it's more like meaty. So then they were able to, they purchased manipulatives because, the widgets. They've added additional staff to that. It's not a paraprofessional, doesn't have that necessarily the skill set, but it's an extra person in that space.
Did you guys provide additional funding for that additional staffer?
No, they were able to use it through their existing funds in that particular example.
I will say that's nice when you're able to do that, right? Because we know that that's not always the case, and so that shouldn't be the expectation either. I'm just saying, some people can do it because their programs, don't have enrollment, all these different things. But, I think that we shouldn't, leave that on the providers to kind of figure out what the additional staff, especially when it was said that there's no para shortage. So we should be able to get a para for this young person. So we should definitely connect with DOE today so they can get a para so that they can use that funding for something else. I'm just saying. So we're almost home. We're almost done with my questions. So we know that in Summer Rising, the first year with students with disabilities, there were a lot of hiccups. But I know last year we addressed many of those hiccups. And so, but some of the issue is still around the trainings, the lack of training that was provided. Providers were saying that they were given a 2-hour virtual training on aiding students with disabilities. Providers shared that committees that they had, they didn't have hands-on training and to learn best practice to engage, educate, and discipline students with disabilities. So can you talk about like some of the changes that you made this year around ensuring that staff was prepared to serve those students in Summer Rising, and what did those trainings look like? And were those all virtual? Do we bring them in person this year? What did that look like? So we can...
We continue to strengthen our relationship. We did many trainings through Change Impact, as I mentioned, like I can count them up, but like roughly a dozen trainings, some in person at DYCD at 2 Lafayette, some live but virtual, some asynchronous. We offered a lot of training to CBO provider staff. Acknowledge we have to keep that up. We have to continue to have staff trained. Sometimes you're not seeking out training until you're in a position where you really realize that you need some additional supports. So we do feel it's our duty to keep that training ongoing and make sure that staff have the supports they need. Also, I want to say, like Ariana's team over at DOE, they offered, this was in the Summer Rising Guide, available to everybody, on-site coaching. I think despite the fact that we said that again and again, it was probably underutilized. There were programs that said, please, like, come out to our site, tell us specifically what this should look like, what approach we should take, help model what we're gonna, how we deal with a young person. So I think we acknowledge that it has to be provided in a lot of different ways, and as we try to strengthen those approaches, we wanna make sure providers know and take advantage.
I think that the on-site coaching can be especially valuable because, as you mentioned earlier, Chair, a lot of the people that staff on the ground these programs come on board very shortly before the summer starts, and they might not be able to participate in training in May or April or whenever we start rolling out these trainings that mainly go to the program directors who are meant to turnkey it, but sometimes that doesn't happen. And so we really want to make sure that we're hitting the staff that are, the young people that are actually going to be working with these children, and making sure that they have the tools to feel confident and secure in providing the support. And so we'll continue to strengthen the support that we provide them to make sure that they that they have all the tools in their disposal.
Yeah, no, definitely. Like I said, the first year, I know that was probably one of the complaints I heard most was around, this surge of population of young people that they never served before. And then it was this expectation that, all right, well, you'll just get online. And it was challenging, and to me, what didn't feel safe, right? And, because providers, are always leading with their heart and just always want to accommodate people, and it's never easy to tell a parent no, and so, and did it, and, did it to the best of their abilities. But I think that we definitely need to make sure that we're consistently looking at this and evaluating it. It was better this prior summer. There was less complaints, obviously, because I think we were a little bit more prepared. But I think as we're moving forward, and also understanding that summer's going to look different than it did these last 2 years, thinking about how are we preparing for those changes.
You may begin when ready.
All right, great. Thank you so much. My name is Nora Moran. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy at United Neighborhood Houses. We represent New York City settlement houses. I feel like a lot of the points I was going to make have already been made through Q&A, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. But our settlement house providers provide a lot of after-school programming in school buildings and community-based settings. Our Summer Rising providers provide a whole other host of youth development programs. This is an issue that is very important to them. I'm really glad we're having this hearing. I think overall CBOs really want to ensure access for youth with disabilities, right? We need to make sure that families who need after-school supports can get it. It is often challenging for a lot of the reasons that were came up in Q&A. A couple of things just to highlight. First, in our most recent memory, I think the most intentional effort to include youth with disabilities in after-school and summer programming was Summer Rising, which was really good, right? It was a positive thing that families knew that this was available to them. It was messaged in the programming, made very public, but providers often felt like they were very unprepared and did not have the right resources and supports to adequately serve these students. Some of the specific ways that we can improve upon that next year, exploring some way for providers to get access to IEPs. We know that there's a lot of legal concerns. Maybe there's some way we can explore, right, asking parents proactively to share that information, but providers said consistently, if we didn't know that it was on the IEP and a young person was in our programming, maybe they were a runner or had some other kind of issue, a lot of unsafe safety situations, dangerous things, and there needs to be some way to try and clear that up from the beginning so we don't wind up with problems down the line. More ongoing training for providers. We know that there was some training given last year in the spring, but I know there was the on-site coaching, which was definitely really helpful for providers who took that up. But throughout the year, right, ensuring that there's consistent training supports, things that are in person, right? Sometimes people just learn better when they're not on a Zoom and they're doing 20 other things on a Zoom. And then the last thing is really making sure that their DOE has an adequate pool of paras. That was something that providers reported. There just was not enough paras, particularly at the start of the program, and so sometimes a young person would go maybe 2 weeks in before getting assigned a paraprofessional, and it was not good. We know that DYCD has another RFP coming up, and that's, I think, going to be a really important opportunity to explore how do we support this population, some things to explore, making sure that there's, the right rates for providers working with youth with disabilities, maybe if there's a specific program that's tailored for students, making sure that's publicly available, right? I don't know that our providers always know that there are specific after-school programs that are designed to serve youth with disabilities. So making sure that that information is also really public to all providers, so that way, if maybe one provider feels like they can't accommodate somebody, they know where to refer folks to. The council also can renew its Autism Awareness Initiative, very important way to support this population. And the last thing I'd just say is that we are deeply, deeply concerned about the mayor's November mod, which included a cut to after-school programming. There are over 3,500 slots that are set to be eliminated in FY25. We can't talk about access for youth with disabilities if we can't make sure there's access for all youth to begin with. So encourage the council to look closely at that. Thank you.
Thanks for basically summing up all of our main points from the hearing.
Hi, good morning. My name is Molly Senak, and I'm testifying on behalf of Center for Independence of the Disabled New York as their education and employment community organizer. So the challenge of providing students with disabilities all of the related services they are entitled to predates the pandemic. With shortages in school psychologists, students struggle to receive the evaluations they need to determine eligibility and placement in related services, and then shortages in special education teachers limit access to those related services, and then shortages in administrators and hearings officials limit the compensatory services they are able to receive after those initial related services are not provided. So while these problems existed prior to the pandemic, virtual and remote learning greatly exacerbated them. There was a 57% drop in special education evaluations, and 24,000 students were unable to fully receive services like physical and occupational therapy, which are impossible to deliver remotely. After-school programs, whether they are launched by individual schools or whether they are centralized programs like SEED, are designed to fill those gaps. They provide services that are, for whatever reason, inaccessible during the school day. They may address children's academic needs. They might fill in gaps in therapies that schools cannot provide. They might address sensory needs that might not otherwise have a designated place within the school system to be addressed to begin with. Many New York City public school families cannot afford private tutors or therapists or lawyers to navigate the compensatory service hearings process. So these programs are a necessary option for families, especially as budget cuts and expiring federal funds force even greater reductions in what is offered during the school day. So that being said, the only questions we should be asking on how we can support these programs, not on whether or not they deserve support, obviously. So what that could look like is expanding initiatives to encourage teachers to enter special education in the first place. That way teachers aren't at the risk of burning out as they are forced to work overtime. We need to improve transportation to and from these programs. We need to improve communication and transparency between the providers of these programs and the parents of the students who will benefit from them. And we need to make funding available to outside organizations like Sydney, to help provide the evaluations to identify the students who need these programs in the first place. And with these supports, we will be helping to safeguard programs that ensure students with disabilities actually receive an education that is substantive and appropriate to their needs, and evens the opportunities for success with their non-disabled peers. Thank you.
You have a question? Okay. Just really quickly, and I know, Nora, do you know the programs or the breakdown for the programs that are specifically to serve students with disabilities? Because, you know, they said it's 64, and I was interested to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, I know of a few that are run by providers in our network because I know they're providers, but beyond, like, I even learned a couple that were mentioned on the panel that I didn't know about. And I think too, I think it was shared those are not on Discover DYCD.
Well, yeah, they don't distinguish them on DYCD around specifically, which I found fascinating, especially because they're being paid additional money to do this. And I don't know why they just are mixing them all in and like Skittles, pick which one.
Yeah, and I know a lot of times Discover DYCD is used by like providers to help families navigate, let me find you another service or program. And so if they're maybe looking for, you know, something that's, if they have a child they can't serve because it's not a safe setting, how are they going to find somewhere else that might, you know, be able to serve this young person if that online access isn't, it's not, you know, it's not distinguished in Discover DYCD.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, that was one of the hardest conversations that I had to have when I had to dismiss a student and was not able to provide options. And you know, even in the provider network, like I know a lot of providers and new folks, but still didn't know where that could be located. And honestly, I don't really know what the distinguishing of the programs were. It seemed very similar. It was like I'm kind of shuffling the young person to another program. So just thinking about that. So definitely I'm interested to see that when the next RFP come out, how do we ensure that, you know, if we know that the school has a high number of RFP, why are we not, have a high number of students with disabilities and IEPs, why are we not then setting aside specific numbers so that we can do things like they said, oh yeah, they were able to provide another support in the room. Yes, sometimes that is the case. We might need more support, but that's not fair for the onus to be on the provider. It should be a part of the contracts. But those are the questions I have to.
First, thank you, Nora and Molly, for both being here, and I love everything that both of your organizations do, and thank you for everything and all the services you provide for the city. Very grateful. I just out of curiosity, I don't know how much you both heard about from the earlier part of the hearing, but one of the questions that we were asking the agencies was around the paraprofessionals, because I think they were saying that they had an adequate amount, but then according to, you know, a lot of the testimonies and what Councilmember Aviles' question was around is there doesn't seem to be enough, and the wait time is extremely long. And so I'm just wondering, based on your experiences and what you're hearing from your, you know, families and providers, how is there seems to be a discrepancy.
There is a dearth of paraprofessionals. There are not enough paraprofessionals.
Right.
There are not even close to enough paraprofessionals. Paraprofessionals are not paid enough. Yeah. And so oftentimes also you're not even necessarily attracting candidates who are going to care enough, because the ones who do care and the ones who are doing it because they care are likely going to be forced out. I can't remember the exact number, but I know that Councilwoman Aviles has a resolution for a prevailing wage in which she mentions that something like 75% of paraprofessionals who are planning to leave the profession are doing so because they are underpaid. And frankly, these numbers are going to get worse because a part of the push to encourage more people to enter the field of special education is creating a better pipeline to get more paraprofessionals into teaching positions, which obviously, great. We love to see more special education teachers, but you don't want to take from one supply in order to fill another.
But it's so interesting when you even say that, because it's like a pipeline that they're, even with the after school folks, they literally pull from that pool and pull them into the paraprofessional that then pull them into teaching. And so it's this weird line that we have going where everyone is just like, oh, okay, that's great. Because I know I lost a lot of my youth educators to become paraprofessionals because it's more than what we can pay and it's more hours. So.
Then one other. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I just said one. So you're good. I can't speak to September to June, 8 to 3, whether there's a shortage there. But for our providers, the biggest place they come into contact with paras is during summer rising, or has been in the past few years, and they've shared there that there's not enough. And I think the big challenges for youth who only have like a IEP for the school year and not a 12-month IEP. And so then those young people, if they go into summer rising, would need a para assigned to them. And those are the ones that often are waiting a while. And last year it was very uneven in terms of access, right? Some folks were matched right away, other youth had to wait. And so having like an adequate pool is really important. Everything you said about like the creating a professionalization of these careers, right? That we want people to start in them. It's a good job, grow to, move on to maybe be a teacher, whatever. But like, we have to make sure we're not just like robbing from the pool of lowest paid workers and not replenishing that.
It's also just, and when you were speaking, it's just interesting when we're thinking about like this, the pool of folks who are there and how. I just lost my train of thought, sorry. I'll remember it at some point. It was good too. Sorry.
I'll ask my other question and maybe you can think you can interrupt me. Just a really quick question, because in here it says the 57% drop in special education evaluations. That seems like a lot, and that was due to the virtual remote learning, which greatly exacerbated them. It contributed. It was already there, but it contributed. So has that gone back up to more normal-ish numbers, or?
There's been a slight uptick since the first year of the pandemic. However, as I'm sure everyone here is aware, with the expiring federal funds, a huge part of what that $7 billion was going to was school psychologists.
Yeah.
And now that unless there is a way to replenish that funding, either at the city level or the state level, those psychologists are going to be cut again, which means that not only are we going to lose any momentum we gained in fixing a problem that was exacerbated during the pandemic, we are going to be going even further backwards. The problem is going to get worse, not better.
Sorry, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but is it only, my question I guess is it only psychologists, or is it any mental health professional that can do the evaluation?
That's a great question.
Psychologists are harder to come by, that's why.
They are.
Yeah, but a lot of them share them. I thought it was school psychologists.
It does not have to be a school psychologist, but obviously the problem is what families have access to.
Right.
And so having an additional person within the school system who is able to provide those evaluations and is able to help families, like they can get an evaluation from a number of different professionals. It's just about what families have access to. And the point is that even like schools are going to be cutting a lot of those professionals. They're cutting social workers, they're cutting therapists, they're cutting school psychologists, they're cutting nurses,
Yeah, and that's something that I know on the council last year. Last year and the year before. Those were things that we really fought hard to make sure that were fully funded. And it was crazy because I think at some point when we were talking to DOE during one of the hearings, they hadn't met their numbers yet, and all of a sudden in a few months they met, like, you know, they all of a sudden had mental health professionals in all the schools, which seemed a little of a reach to me. But then I know that they do share, because like my son's school, for example, they have the social worker there who goes to, you know, 2 or 3 different schools during the week. So I know that they have that model, but still it's, I guess, better than not having one at all. So that's something we need to look out for with the budget cuts coming up.
Yeah, like the fixes they found still are imperfect.
Right.
And the fact, you know, it's always very difficult to remember what having a stuffy nose feels like when you can breathe clearly. And so because the programs are imperfect, I think a lot of people aren't realizing how bad it's going to get once those are gone.
Yep.
I remember my question. All right. So I know DOE testified today that they were not aware of a para shortage, and that if families need them, because that they can get one for after school. And today it made it seem very easy, like you just call and they're like, all right, para's on its way. And I mentioned here that I ran after school for over 12 years, and in the 12 years I only had a para 1 year, and that was it. I ended up having to hire them because I needed to keep them on because DOE wouldn't. So can you guys talk to me a little bit about what, like, around programming and kind of debunking that? Because I'm like, I know I'm not crazy. There has not been, it hasn't been an easy process to get paras in the after school program. And I know I'm not crazy, but it seemed like I was.
What I will say is that oftentimes and a lot of these stories are anecdotal rather than data-based, just because a lot of
because no one's tracking it, and it's intentionally not being tracked, which we got to today.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of what we hear parents and students talk about is the fact that usually after-school programs are tailored to the student's needs based on what the school has, rather than what the school has being tailored to based on what the student needs.
Yeah,
exactly. And so if again, I'm just speaking anecdotally, I cannot speak for what the official process is. If a school does not have a paraprofessional, then whether or not the student needs one, they will not be able to offer a sufficient number of paras.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I anecdotally, I know that this is true because I experienced it, and I'm like, did something change in the last 2 years? And I don't think it has, but.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, right, before this hearing, we asked a lot of our providers, like, what does this look like for you? And it was, I think, very similar to your experience when you were a provider, right? That sometimes it happened, but rarely not. And I think the thing we heard from our providers overall is that with school year after school, with summarizing, the really biggest variable is your relationship with your principal. And so if you have that solid relationship with your principal and school leadership, support for all students, but especially for students with disabilities, is going to look a lot better than in schools where that relationship is not as strong, or maybe it's just non-existent. And so, that's not been, from what I've heard from our providers, that's not necessarily been their experience, right? That like 3 o'clock comes, this child needs a paraprofessional, you call up, the person's there right away. Like, it's not been like that. But
the way they mentioned it, it seemed very seamless and effortless. And I was just like, what? Am I crazy? So I'm not, thank you.
Right. But it also, like our providers shared, like, sometimes we're just not equipped to serve youth with disabilities in after school, especially. Yeah. And so we have to refer families elsewhere. And so
referring elsewhere always also gets me, because no one knows any of these programs. And honestly, they seem like the same program.
Yeah. So, right, and referring elsewhere isn't necessarily like I'm referring you to this other Compass provider, right? It might be like trying to explore, I don't know what kinds of supports you might be able to find for a young person, but it's hard. There's not really a lot of support out there for these families.
Yeah. That has been my experience, and like I had mentioned before, this is one of the things that I think that we don't talk about enough, and it's been in the closet per se for a while, and definitely want to make sure we continue exploring this topic. But I don't have any more questions for this panel, so thank you guys so much. Really appreciate you guys being here. It's very helpful.
Thank you. That concludes our in-person testimony. We will now transition to remote testimony, and our first virtual panelist will be Nisa Jones. You may begin when the sergeant starts your clock.
Time starts now.
Hi, my name is Lisa Jones. I'm a student at the CUNY School of Public Health, and I just wanted to gear your attention to a different issue, more so the nutritional state of children in my neighborhood. The battle against childhood obesity has been an ongoing one in the United States as health agencies, political officials, and community activists work together in order to develop policies to tackle the phenomenon head on. Overwhelming amounts of research has proven that the main driver of preventable illness from diet-related diseases and premature death in children and young adults is the overconsumption of sugary beverages that are high in calories, unhealthy foods, and a lifestyle that lacks physical activity. Through the use of misleading and predatory marketing, the food industry exerts a heavy influence on the physical and social environments where children spend most of their free time, including social media spaces, thus influencing them to make unhealthy nutritional choices on a consistent basis, both inside and outside of school settings. The childhood obesity epidemic in the United States has been on a steady incline for the last 2 decades, with children of Black and Latinx communities being disproportionately affected, and 15 to 19.4% of the children in New York are overweight, and an additional 22 to 27% are considered obese. While children do not maintain the abilities to decipher between marketing that is factual and those that are not, and while it is inherently the responsibility of parents and guardians to enforce healthy practices, it is very hard for parents to compete with the compelling and illuminating advertisements that are constantly being presented to their children in and out of their presence. So, as technology advances, the ways in which big food companies connect to their children also advances, thus making it harder for both children and parents to identify. Introduced by Assembly Member Karine Reyes, there is currently a bill under review, Bill A422 4B, that provides enforcement and provides a private right of action. The program helped to receive recommendations from Department of Agriculture, Health and Human Services, and the CDC in order to promote nutritional education in the households and in after-school programs and prompt regular physical activity. I would just like for you guys to all consider supporting the bill, and as it getting into the state level, it will help to discourage the dissemination of false food marketing across New York State and encourage healthier lifestyle choices in our youth. I hope to gain community and policy support in order to help with the fight to eradicate childhood obesity. So, thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. We have 2 more virtual panelists signed up, but I'm not sure if they're on, so I'll just call their names. Diane Colonna and Tameen Ula. We're just going to pause for a brief 5 minutes.
I would like to acknowledge Councilmember Williams. Thank you for joining us, and apparently she has a comment.
Thank you, chairs. I just wanted to talk about the fact that I do have a staffer who was part-time for pretty much a year, and she was a paraprofessional, and she was very stressed out and burnt out and decided to come work with me for full-time. So it's very real, and she is still very traumatized from being a para.
Okay, that concludes our virtual testimony. If we missed anyone who would like to testify virtually, please raise your hand and I will call on you in the order of hands raised. Seeing no one else, I would like to note that written testimony, which will be reviewed in full by committee staff, may be submitted to the record up to 72 hours after the close of this hearing by emailing it to testimony@council.nyc.gov, and I will turn it back to the chair for closing statements.
Like I mentioned a number of times today, that this hearing was very near and dear to me because when I was a provider, this was something that I did not feel like that was being addressed. And even from today's hearing, I think that there is so much work to be done at making sure that we are providing support to students with disabilities to receive after-school funding after school support, and also making sure that providers are adequately trained and staffed in order to provide this service. Like I said, there's a lot of work to be done, and I think that we're going to continue to work with DYCD and DOE and MOPD to really think about how do we dig in and to provide a service that should have been being provided for all of these years. So I look forward to the continued collaboration with Chair Lee, and thank you for your hard work and all committee staff. But this is the conclusion of this hearing, however, not a conclusion of this topic, and we will continue to work to ensure that students with disabilities have the same access as all students throughout the city. So thank you everyone for here, and with that, I conclude this hearing.